This was the home of Bob Cuthbertson and his father and his brother. The Cuthbertsons, they came from Robert Bryan Cuthbertson. He came from Scotland in 1880. And he started the printing works. He was a Scottish Presbyterian. He came from Ayrshire in Scotland, Saltcoats in Ayrshire. He came to Listowel and started his first printing works in Upper Church Street, the home of Ned Wilmot, a blacksmith. And he rented the front room, and he lived and worked in the same room, the front room of Wilmot's. As his family grew, they came down here and they rented this place off the Enrights further down the street. And they had a presence in Listowel until 1960. Bob was the last of the Cuthbertsons, and Bob had a problem. He was an alcoholic and he had a sad end. He actually died on a table. The only bit of furniture in his kitchen. Bob got a wonderful funeral, and the crowds came from all over North Kerry to pay their respects to one of, I thought, one of the nicest gentlemen in North Kerry. Posters in my book is a poster of the Sinn Féin election poster of 1918. Historically, it's very important. It is a wonderful poster, and it was at the time the main posters for Sinn Féin were in Dublin. They were the big poster companies, the big printing companies. However, there was a curfew on them because the British knew there was something afoot, and they came down to Listowel, and Cuthbertson printed 3,000 copies of the Sinn Féin, which basically is the manifesto. And so it's a little connection with history. We move on further now. Known as Pound Lane. There was a pound below where the Mermaid's restaurant is. In the 1850s, Lord Listowel decreed that he'd rename the streets after his own family. And he called this street William Street, Upper and Lower. This is Upper from across the road, and Charles Street divides it with Lower William Street. Back in the 1920s, a wave of nationalism swept over the town, and people decided to rename the streets. They renamed Lower William Street Pierce Street, and they renamed Upper William Street Patrick Street. Now, if you look at the name, up on the name plates, they have academic family. They all done very well. They became doctors, psychiatrists. One of them, a great friend of mine, was the head man in the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. His brother, who had qualified and attended Kelly. When Eamon Kelly came to Listowel, he fell for Mara, because I tell Mara was better looking than he was. And they appeared with the Listowel Drama Group in a lot of productions, and eventually they took the Playboy of the Western World, and was seen by the directors of the Abbey Theatre, and the rest is history. They were taken to Dublin, and they were both members of the Radio Éireann Players and the Abbey Theatre. And you all know him and Kenny as the Shanachie. By Lord Buckley. Lord Buckley was a very well known man in Listowel. He was a cooper, and he was over the Temperance Society. And through him they built a hall down the street called St. Patrick's Hall. A very vibrant hall, and showed us there for cooking. And she got the job in the Butler Arms. That's not Kathy Buxley. That's my wife, Kathy. And Kathy went to get a summer job down in the Butler Arms. And she was there as a cooking assistant. During her time there, a man called J.P. Morgan came as he had business interest in the cable station. And this particular evening, Kathy was doing the cooking. And it must have been particularly nice because he went into the kitchen, the tanker and the pressure. And while he was there, he said, "Would you like to come to America with me?" So she said, if my father would let me. So J.P. Morgan wrote in our booklet, The Cooper, and with his conditions, what she'd be paid and where she'd work. And our booklet wrote back to J.P. Morgan and said, well, if Kathy wants to go there, she can with my blessing. However, if she is unhappy, she has to be sent back, not on the first plane, but on the first ship. So anyway, Kathy went there, and she spent many, many years as Morgan's cook. And she ruled Morgan's kitchen with an iron fist. She was supposed to be very good. Now, Calvin Coolidge was so impressed with the food, he went into the kitchen and he said, Kathy, would you like to come to the White House? So she went to the White House and she stayed there with 3 presidents. Coolidge, Hoover and Roosevelt. She spent half her time with Roosevelt and she left because I think, like many others, she didn't get on very well with Eleanor Roosevelt. Some years ago, the food fair in Listowel wanted to wander, and
a pine tree on the hills of Maryland, through many summer heats and winter snows, felled, carted, quartered, sown, a metamorphosis within a week, and then a century buried deep within White House walls, unseen, unsung, but one of the myriads holding firm together the storied structure, until a new age came and replaced steel for wood. Then, months upon the dump heap, the dump cart actually arrived for one last ride, and then a rescue. Now here I rest upon your desk for a short space, until the wastebasket and the fire. Then once again I'll go, free smoke before free wind, to touch again the hills of Maryland.
Had he left anything of the substance to do with Listowel? And he said he was actually doing an audio of the Gift of Ink. No, this was an era before the CD. So what he sent me on was the folder for the frontage of the audio. So, but this is the original. And just to show, just as one example of some people have no and excuse the language, would nearly put their head into the skip. Some fella shouted, "Fuck off from the skip!" So she got nothing. Now we move up. We'll have to go up. The little building is there. That was Moore's Forge. That forge was there from the 1850s. Across the way here, in front of where number 4 is, was a small thatched house. And the Enright family lived there for about 40 years. 2-roomed house. The oldest of the family, or the eldest of the family, was Timmy. Timmy, at one stage, John B said to me, went to the national school, went to St. Michael's. He had a love of the classics, and in his Leaving Cert class, he was also an avid socialist, and he was trying to indoctrinate the other pupils. So much so, the president at the time decided he was having no more of it, and he said, you can face expulsion or else you'll have to renege on your socialist ideas. And he took expulsion in his Leaving Cert class. He went back working for a Moriarty family in Dingle and done the matriculation and was accepted into Trinity College in Dublin. He got a first-class honours degree in the classics. Couldn't get a job in Ireland because of his political views. So he went to England. And 'twas ironic, he slept in a graveyard the first night over there, under Cromwell's grave. That's true. He finished up in the Eland Road Comprehensive, where he was teaching the classics. When he started there, they got very few honours in that school. When he finished, when he retired, they were in the top 10 of the classic teaching schools in England. And there were a lot of schools teaching classics. Croghan's Island Crosstalk, and Mihalo Gaheens a pity Yoke does not last. That's Timmy Enright. We salute you, Timmy. Okay, he lived there with his family. Jacko was pulled in the time the DI was shot in Church Street, an innocent party. The DI, which I will talk on later, the DI had been shot, and the people that shot him had got away. And the British authorities were so intent on getting someone, they pulled in 3 people, and they actually court-martialed them, and 2 of them were sentenced to death. And Jacko Linehan was one of those. And Jacko was living across the road there. He was a carpenter. Now, Jacko had a number of children, and one of them was Gerald Linehan. And Gerald Linehan worked for Ascon, and he finished up living in Cork, and he had a son, Donal Linehan. So if any of you are interested in rugby, Donal Linehan's grandfather was born over there, and Donal spent most of his young holidays over there as well. And he wrote a book some years ago called My Life in Rugby. He had been captain, manager of the Irish team, and he was also captain and manager of the Lions. Okay, we went to Hanlon, and he was a founder member of the Writers' Week, and who better to describe his father but his son Eamon.
Started off life in Bailieborough and then came to Listowel, a town that he absolutely loved, and he forged marvellous links with John B. and Brian, Tim Danaher, Noel O'Rellihan, and many others who were really the inspiration behind Writers' Week. He was chairperson for the first 7 years, and he absolutely loved it. Walked many times up the Mail Road with Brian, and indeed, to tell a story about myself, Brian was my teacher, and he was a great inspiration to me. But one day they were going up the road together, and Brian looked at Louis and he says, "Louis, I have a confession to make." And he says, "What's that, Brian?" He says, "Well," he says, "I'm afraid," he says, "I gave your son Eamon a bit of a hiding today." And my father looked at him and said, "Well, if you did, I'm sure he deserved it." But Dad loved the story, and even though he was here for most of his life, he never really lost contact with his northern roots. And in the last 20 to 30 years, he and I used to go back up north every year. And literally, when we would go across the border, I would see my dad change, both emotionally and physically, and that's where I learned so much about him. He said very little, believe it or not, when we were growing up, about his upbringing in the north. I talked about him a few years ago at Writers' Week, and the title of the talk that I gave was "A Man of Two Counties."
And at the time, he put Taraza was the in thing, and he put Taraza everywhere. He did Taraza County, Taraza seats and the chairs, terrazza on the floor, terrazza on the walls, terrazza everywhere. There were 2 snugs, left and right, as you go into the bar. And the final embellishment was the name. And he got the best signwriter in Munster, Francie Chute, to write the name. And it was a Saturday when he was at it. He had a trestle and he was up painting the name. And 2 well-known porter sharks were coming down from Ballyglogue, and they were walking down, they were going drinking for the evening. So one of them looked up and said to Francie, "Francie, what name is going up there?" And Francie looked at it, which was half covered, and he looked to them and he said, "You'll see it when you're coming home." So sometime later that night, they were staggering up the street. Now one of them thought he was smarter than the other fella, and he looked up and he couldn't recognise the name, so he said to the other fella, "I bet you don't know the meaning of that. What's the meaning of that?" And the man looked up, and the name of the pub was Rendezvous. And the other fella says, "I do," says he, "that's the French for Shanahan." You have the Starn Garter. That belonged to a Miss Stack from Knockanoor. And that was the scene of the shooting, which is the central part of Fergal Cale's book, Wounds. Tobias O'Sullivan, the inspector, had left the barracks down below here and was walking up the street, and in the meantime 3 volunteers, Brosnan, Ahern, and the third name escapes, were waiting inside. They were inside the window. Now, from where they were, they couldn't see anyone coming up the street, but they had a decoy walking on this side, a man called Sheehan, Jeremiah Sheehan. But Toby O'Sullivan stopped at the corner there. He was accosted by somebody who wanted to know something about his son's pension, who had been in the police force. So Sheehan had to stop, and he retraced his steps, and when Tobias O'Sullivan, the inspector, started walking again, Sheehan kept walking opposite him. And as soon as he got to here, the 3 boys rushed out and they shot him. He was living up where the...
Good morning, everyone. My name is Roman Wilmot, and I'm a long time friend of Vincent.
This includes a woman called Babe Jo Wilmot, who was a sister of Seamus Wilmot, and she was more than a character. She was Mrs. Trusted, Babe Jo, and she had a great saying, "Lovely Holman boy." Anyway, Mrs. Kelly, she was a lady. She was inside the counter here. She was a milliner, and she was at her hats, and Babe Jo was on her daily round with 2 enamel buckets, because she had 2 pigs, 2 little pigs called Hansel and Gretel. And she'd go around looking for slops, and it was Writer's Week. And she stood at the door while Mrs. Kelly was inside with her head down, and she was giving a broadcast of who and the great and mighty going up and down the street because of Writer's Week. And all of a sudden, coming up past the barracks up towards Forest Lane, came Brendan Kennedy with about 5 women hanging off him. And at the time, you had the Irish troops had been out in the Congo, and there was a tribe in the Congo, they were cannibals, they were called Balubas. Now at the time, if you wanted to insult anyone, you would call them a dirty Baluba. But anyway, the word had come back into the vernacular. And at this time,
Eventually, one night he dropped dead, right? They called the priest and they called the doctor. The priest was Father Willie O'Brien, you remember him. He was a bit eccentric as well. But Father Willie brought up his ointments and things, but he forgot something to apply the ointments with. But luckily, Babe Jo had been at a chiropodist that day and she took the cotton wool from between her two toes and Eddie Lawley was anointed. Thank you.
if you have time, there's a lovely plaque inside the door, and it's inside just on the front, above the step. It's to commemorate mutiny that took place in the barracks in 1921. A short few words, the British authorities issued a shoot-to-kill policy, and the members who were members of the RIC, all Irishmen, refused to take up the orders, and they gave back their swords and their guns and their belts, and it was called the Listowel Mutiny, and it caused a great controversy on the floor of the Commons in London. You write short stories. One story here, there's a beautiful, it's another work which is being done up at the moment of McAuliffe's. It's called The Harp and Line. Now there are 3 languages in it. You have Latin, French and Irish. And they were looking in awe at this. And one of them said, "Hey son, you know what that's about?" And of course, John B was expecting to get a 6pence or a shilling. And he said, "I do, sir." He said, "What is it about?" And he said, first, on the upper part, he said, behind the line, is Latin. And he said, "What does it mean?" Well, he said, "It means I am a lion." And Maison de Villa, that really means a townhouse, or a house in the town. And his son Morris has also wrote about it. When you're passing down, you might have a look up, you can see another one of McAuliffe Street past the works, up in it's called the Emporium, and it's probably one of McAuliffe's best works. And people don't see it, it's the Great American Eagle is up on the roof. And just one story, I was doing a book back in '89 called North Kerry Camera, and in it I had a whole series of pictures, and I divided the book into sections. And Bryan MacMahon was writing the foreword, and he was writing an introduction to the people, and John B was writing an introduction to the streets. And Eamon Kane